I bring greetings from the Githable country in northern New South Wales. My name is Jane Lennon and I'm an honorary life member of ICOMOS and Australia ICOMOS and a member of the ISC on cultural landscapes. Australia is a very big country, a whole continent, an ancient relic of Gondwana and very arid. But it was occupied by Aboriginal people for at least 60,000 years. And you can see some of this evidence here. Then European settlement began in 1788 with, from then on, irreparable changes to our environment and our landscapes. Land use in Australia is quite surprising. More than half of the continent is grazed, and nearly 40% is in some form of nature conservation or conservation reserves and the natural environment. That doesn't necessarily mean it's managed though. And you can see that most of the wealth of the cropping, forestry and intensive uses is very small. In nearly 20% of Australia's land mass is now protected in a national reserve system of over 13,000 protected areas. And this is a great increase from 2% in 1971. So the last 50 years has seen a great interest in protecting landscapes. A key change was in 1997 when Indigenous protected area designation was also introduced following the very historic Mabo decision on native title for Indigenous people back to their own Aboriginal lands. And here you can see the combination of the Indigenous lands with the National Reserve System. This is a very complicated timeline, but the key dates affecting landscape conservation in Australia are 1879, when Royal National Park in New South Wales became the world's second national park. In 1901, the Commonwealth of Australia was founded by the colonies federating, but land use and regulation remains a state responsibility, which means most protection happens at the state or provincial level. In 1974, Australia ratified the World Heritage Convention, a very early signatory. The next year, the Australian Heritage Commission was established and Australia ICOMOS in 1976. But it was our Burra Charter in 1979 which affected legislation and practice from then on. In 1981, Australia's first World Heritage Sites were declared. Kakadu, Willandra Lakes with Lake Mungo, the great Aboriginal site, and the Great Barrier Reef. And in 1986, Landcare was established to restore degraded lands and waterways, in other words, private initiatives. And then we had new legislation federally in 1999 and 2003, but this is under review. The meeting at Burra, which is an historic mining town in South Australia, led to guidelines for the conservation, not preservation, of places of cultural significance. And this in turn was very important for landscape conservation. Initially looking at buildings and townscapes, but quickly moving into landscapes. The concept of place was very important, linking natural heritage and cultural values. So we could conserve an extensive place or a small place like a garden, but with cultural significance, resulting from aesthetic, historic, social, scientific, and associative values given to it. Since 1981, there have been 20 World Heritage Sites, 4 cultural, 4 mixed, and 12 natural. And in 2003, a National Heritage List was set up, which also looked at some landscapes and great groupings, such as the Australian Alps National Parks across the highest country of Australia. But what was important there are the aesthetic characteristics and for the first time, Indigenous tradition being part of the criteria. Australian approaches to landscape aesthetics have always considered whether the aesthetics are held in high esteem by the community, and aesthetic responses to place may be sensory or experiential, or a combination of these applied to landscapes of historical, sacred, or natural values, as you can see in these illustrations.
Jane, sorry, you have 2 minutes. You have 2 minutes, please.
Thank you. Many issues in landscape protection have become very obvious to us. The land of natural disasters, bushfires and floods, and I am currently caught out in my cottage in the forest by floods. Overclearing and habitat fragmentation has caused both physical and cultural dislocation to flora and fauna. Property amalgamations, agribusiness, and monoculture of crops is another threat. Meanwhile, heritage protection is given to only a very small percentage of mostly colonial estates. And we have little discussion of what is a traditional farm, with how much change is acceptable. But how much change is acceptable in Australian rural landscapes, and to whom? Cultural landscapes are those special ones we want to protect, where historic evidence of use gives a distinctive character. But we need to emphasise rural landscapes as a process. For example, an evolving agricultural landscape with resilient features. Australian ecosystems recently have been showing evidence of collapse across 19 major systems, according to the scientists. Our laws are inadequate to protect the ecosystems, and we now have cumulative impacts leading to death by 1,000 cuts, along with climate change. The evolving rural landscape requires a bold vision, action, and resilience in this heating environment, not just sitting on the fence. We require strong political leadership and political will, because we do have the tools and we do have communities anxious for action. Thank you.